So for 3D printing, there's a couple things you want to watch out for. Basically, the simplest, best way to get a print done is to have a solid single shelled object with no kind of deep cavities or undercuts. By undercut, I mean something like this. This can have supports printed. So this part will not just print in the air. It will be supported by something. So usually there are supports that are generated. And right now, if you're doing a bust, I recommend a bust or a character. Make sure you put a bit of a pedestal underneath so that it can support the object, prevent it from tilting. And usually I will still try to clean up the bottom of my mesh if I just solo this, right? So it'll have a kind of clean, simple, flat bottom. So as I mentioned, sometimes when you have these little areas, they can be little supports that are added, which can cause issues, but nothing too major. So what I've got here, you've got two approaches to basically merging this into one solid shell object. You can either Dynamesh or Boolean. Either method is fine. I'll just show you the Boolean first. So usually if I have divisions, right, I'll say all low. Some are low, some are high poly. So usually I want everything at its highest division level if there are divisions. And for this, I'll go to merge. If you go to merge visible, it will create a single merged object, okay? A single merge tool. But technically, there's still kind of floating parts. If I were to Control-Shift-click on one or the other, it'll hide them and still keep them separate. So at this stage, I basically go to Dynamesh. If you do want to minimize or reduce any fine detail erasure, you can turn down blur, turn off blur, and maybe crank your resolution and see what resolution this gets to. Like I said, you want to watch out for any small cavities, small pockets, and I'll talk a little bit about character with multiple layers of clothing in a minute. So this thing is okay. It's not as super crisp and sharp, mainly because I think this is maxing out at 4 million polys and the original was 8, but still okay. Sometimes you can try and turn off this little dot on Dynamesh, which I think is limiting the resolution to 4 million polys. I'll try one more time. Again, I don't have to get to the highest division. I'm okay without that. Okay. Oops. Sorry, try that one more time. Okay, so once that's done, it's a solid mesh. Usually as a good point, you should go into check mesh to see if there's errors. It says there's a couple errors that are there. Fix mesh and optimize. If you're not using my interface, that would be under geometry, mesh integrity, check mesh, fix mesh, and then optimize is under modify topology, somewhere in here, optimize points. That basically makes the file a lot lighter, essentially. So that's one shell. I don't see any obvious issues. Usually you can go back to and check mesh if there's another problem, but probably not at this case. So you can export a mesh of 1 million plus polys. It's generally not recommended because sometimes the slicer takes longer, and the slicer literally is slicing the model into individual layers because the plastic is pushed out and almost like drawn in 2D, then raised a little bit. Another layer gets printed, right? So that's essentially how it functions. But in here, I usually go into Decimation Master, pre-process current. So decimation will take this current topology, and if I go back in, I do pre-process current. Usually that's the current subtool. And you can select a percentage, so it's going to be the percentage of the original poly count. Well, there's presets. I'll show you what 20K looks like. So what it will do is areas where there's less detail or things are flatter. Everything gets turned into triangles, by the way, but it'll strip out a bunch of triangles in flatter areas and leave more triangles in areas that have more detail. Okay, so if I go right down to 20, you'll see, the bottom especially is like very stripped down, right? Now, 20,000 overall is just not enough for this character. So if I go back, I'm going to undo, Once you've done the pre-process, that's the long part, but you can jump to different numbers. So if I hit 250K, I think it's in points, so that gives me roughly double in polys. Again, if you take a look, the bottom is very stripped down, very large triangles. And as we get into progressively higher detail areas, you'll see more clusters of triangles. Again, if we look at before and after with wireframe, then I'll show you without. Let's just pop back here for a second. All right, so that's before, that's after. Not too much difference, right? So again, we've preserved a lot of detail. So next up, I will go to Z plugin again, and this time I'll go to 3D Print Hub. Usually I'll click on this button, update size ratio. So it's going to kind of take it in the Zbrush scale, which is centimeters, and convert it to millimeters. And I usually like to see it in the kind of like 70 to 150, 200 millimeter range. And if I'm aiming for roughly, let's say a 4 to 5 inch, I often think in inches, but if I'm going for 5 to 6 inches, an inch is about 25.4 millimeters, I think. So you're roughly looking at 125 to 150 millimeters on your highest axes. So if I click on that, if I go back to Z plugin, we should see that there. So Y is my vertical. So I usually kind of go by the tallest or widest axes and determine usually I think about height primarily. So if I want this thing to be about 5 centimeters, then 124 millimeters is fine. If I want it to be 6, then I would set it to 150. Okay. And you can update that by just manually typing in a number into one of those three, X, Y, Z, and it'll update the proportions evenly. And there's 2 file types. I usually will export both, depending on the day and the model. Sometimes you'll have luck with one versus the other. But STL is one kind of file format you can export to. OBJ is another very, very common 3D file format, fairly universal object format. And you can also try 3MF. I'm becoming a bit more familiar with 3MF, but it's becoming also a very popular 3D print format. The printer we have is a Prusa Mark 4S, pretty leading edge consumer slash pro machine. And I think it runs about $1,500. So in this case, I'm just going to simply import my file that I've exported. Okay, so it should come in. Usually you'll see any highlighted errors. So it's a good sort of opportunity to check for any of those issues. Right now, I've just got the thing set to very simple interface. So you've got basically the layer thickness, which determines how fine-tuned the details are. So usually I go with something like more sculpts and things like that. I usually want to go as fine as possible, so I can click on fast detail. There's 2 primary not file types, but 2 primary plastics that I'm basically using. One's PLA, which is like a cornstarch biodegradable plastic. Another that's called PETG, which is basically a bit more durable. You could literally have almost like machine prototype parts with that. So just for longevity and durability, I usually go with PETG. And support, so I'll rotate this, by the way, into position. So usually I'll set my rotation here. And there you go. And again, I can still manipulate. Remember, I set 150 for the size, right? So if I go down, until I want it smaller, I can still update that size ratio, right? So very, very useful. There's infill, and I'll talk a little bit about that. You won't have to worry about this portion of it. I'm just explaining it if you ever do get into printing on your own. Infill is basically how the model is structured internally. We also have the number of walls. So that also increases print time, but it increases strength. So you can have multiple copies of the walls or the actual shell printed. Lately, I've been doing just 2, but for stronger parts, I'll do 3 or sometimes even 4. And then again, thicker infill, which is the percentage here, can lead to, again, stronger parts. But again, I'm going between 10 and 15% usually, sometimes 20 if I want increased strength. So next up, I'm going to hit slice now. So it'll process all these settings. I'll let it do that and pause. I have a summary of about 7 hours, almost 8 hours of print time. And we can sort of see almost the individual layer lines. They're often presented thicker than what they'll actually print as. But one of the problems you might notice is that if you go through certain layers, there's just stuff like overhangs that will not print well, or you see they're kind of suspended in space, right? So that will need supports essentially throughout. And there's a lot of areas where that's probably going to be the case. So you can turn on supports. In this case, I'm going to select everywhere. So that means it'll build supports off of the base model itself. Like let's say off of this podium thing I built up to the chin or whatever. So I'll hit slice now. As I was just saying, the supports do take a little bit of extra work to snap off. So oftentimes I do try to model things or pose things to minimize overhangs, and you can see the print time is also shot up about 3 to 4 hours. So you can have a dramatic increase in print time. But again, sometimes tweaking things like the infill, reducing infill. By the way, the infill, there's different patterns. I'll just show you what that looks like. Oops, sorry, I had to slice again since I changed it. So there you're seeing basically like a grid style infill. And it's also like internal support and strength, right? Because there's the inside and the outside that need some help. So again, 10 hours. And again, if you switch your, let's say your level of detail, sometimes I'll increase the layer thickness, which reduces the amount of detail that can be printed. So if I go to, let's say, from 0.1 millimeter to 0.2 for speed, I'll just transfer all my settings and hit slice now. You can see by basically doubling the layer heights, I go from about a 12-hour print to a 5.5-hour print. So it makes a big difference, okay? Last thing I want to bring up is making sure you have coverage. So if I'll just load up a generic kind of model here. So if we had something like this, again, I do recommend if you're doing a bust or a full character, I'd still make a little pedestal, usually again, enough to kind of cover most of the weight or mass of the character so it can be stable. But we want to avoid as much as humanly possible, any kind of like cavities and things of that nature. Also, if you have low poly looking mesh, that's how it's going to print. So you will want to divide things up as much as possible to give it a nicer, more appealing look. So if it looks low poly, just simply grab it and divide it. And like I said, any cavities like this, you'll have supports and stuff, and these things will be so thin, right? So you can either project out. So what I mean by that is if I just go in here and say project maybe to the furthest point and hit project all, and then solo this, you see it's going to try to push out as many points. But again, you see it gets messy. So it can be complicated when you have character with multiple layers of clothing. So you may decide, maybe I'll opt to just hide some layers. That's one solution. Another solution is to, again, if I have a shirt like this, sometimes I'll just go back, pre-division, and I'll go to, yes, let's go to delete higher. So I'll go to geometry, delete higher, and I'll use my custom interface here to do group by normals, which you can also get to under polygroups down here somewhere. What I usually like to do is actually isolate the outer shell. So hit Control Shift, isolate that, delete hidden, turn off solo. And then again, I'll go to project all. This time I'll turn off the furthest option there. Project all. So you see it kind of shrink wraps to that base. Smooth that out a bit. So this way I can guarantee it's like full on contact, right? So project all. And then I'll use my trick here where I go to dynamic subdivision, dynamic, have a thickness. All right. So you can set it thick enough that you can see, right? So you're kind of like almost over exaggerating that detail there, right? But we're trying to eliminate or completely avoid any gaps. Okay. And then you can hit apply, so that becomes a true part of the mesh. So those are some good techniques to avoid, cavities and gaps and tiny holes that could, especially because the thin parts of the clothing can still be very brittle. So if you're trying to chisel out things between, let's say, the shoulder pad and the shoulder, right, you could very easily snap this one area. So you really want to try to close those gaps up in every spot possible. The question was, can you pose? Absolutely, you should pose. So it's easy if you do it here. If, like I said, if you basically take all your mesh and go to merge visible, right? I've got the merged character now. So then I can sort of take, let's say, part of the arm. Okay, I'll just blur this a bit. I won't get into posing too much in this demo, but just to let you know, yeah, since you got most of the tools there, you can. And by the way, you can also store morph targets too. So store morph target will allow you to quickly kind of fix certain issues if you have this problem. Morph target, store. So it's kind of taking a snapshot. Also, another tool I will use sometimes is holding Control, click and drag with the move skill. Rotate brush can work, although in this case, it's a little bit awkward with the multiple kind of subtools within one subtool. But your best tool is to really pre-merging all. Okay, is to so yeah, sometimes you'll do a little touch-up sculpt, or like I said, some smoothing, or B for brush, M for morph, and then you can hit morph brush, may morph back some of the spots, right? So maybe some of the stuff is a bit too awkward, right? You can try to morph it back into position. The best tool I find is like I said, pre-merging visible, going in, going in here and simply going to Z plugin transpose master. So again, it'll sort of temporarily hide all the division levels and merge the subtool temporarily to something very, very low poly, very easy to typically manipulate. And lately too, I haven't used it yet, and I'm not sure if it's in this version. There's something called proxy pose. I think it's in the next version, but I'm not 100% sure. Or maybe it's under geometry or subtool. But ultimately, yes, I do recommend some kind of posing. If you have your model in Maya, for example, if you can pose it with the rig and then literally select all the mesh and go to delete history, it basically keeps it frozen or captured in a snapshot that you can then just bring into ZBrush and Dynamesh, or like I said, Boolean together. And for Boolean, it's just a matter of turning on your topmost subtool. Again, make sure everything's at its highest division for print quality. Okay, so you go to your top tool, go into live Boolean, make Boolean mesh. Again, it's going to be in a different location without my custom interface, but so that's all Boolean together. And a good way to check too, if you smooth things out, all this should be relatively seamless, right? It shouldn't sort of break in any awkward way. So that can be a good check too for cavities. I know I didn't do the belt, so that's going to be, again, have some sort of weird thin voids and undercuts that will be hard to deal with. But so sometimes, like I said, Booleans can actually be more effective than a Dynamesh because it's not erasing a bunch of detail.